Okay, thank you for being here with us. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be in such a beautiful scenario with so many people after a difficult night. And thank you for our guests to be with us tonight, this afternoon, and to Sergio and Héctor Abad that they just arrived this morning, coming from a long trips. And I introduce you, Héctor Abad is one of the most important Colombian and Latin American writer, very active defending Ukraine in all the social media and in this campaign of Aguanta Ucrania. And Sergio Jaramillo has been working in the public sector for a long time, but especially leading the peace process with FARC guerrilla in Colombia. A long process, took many years until we managed to get to this point, thanks in certain way to this man that also has this idea, among other people, to bring the cause of Ukraine in Latin America and try to get the support. And I want to start with this. Why? In a continent that usually goes and supports these causes when someone is attacked against the imperialism, against the attacks, the invasions, it's necessary to create a campaign. It's called Aguanta Ucrania and Hold Ucrania.
Thank you, Catalina, and it's an enormous pleasure for Héctor and myself to be here. We're just two representatives of a much larger campaign. I want to mention two friends, Francisco Samper and Esteban Martucci, who were instrumental in designing the original idea. And I'm very pleased to see Oleksandra and Victoria again, who were with us in Cartagena in Colombia in January. And before I say why we had this idea, let me just thank you as Colombian and Latin Americans for what you're doing, for what Ukraine is doing, because what you're doing is not only existential for Ukraine, it's existential for the rest of the world. Latin America has a very strong tradition of respect of international law, because that's why we have had peace for 2 centuries in Latin America, because no country invades its neighbor. So what happens here matters to us as well. That's one reason. The other reason is because we also suffered, sadly, a lot of human rights violations, a lot of war crimes. We know what that is like. We've been talking about this with Oleksandra, and people reject this. People from the right, from center, from the left, they reject this. And when you sometimes hear that people in Latin America don't care so much, this is not true. It's true that we have some governments that have geopolitical considerations and take positions that are not useful. But if you ask most people, they're with Ukraine. And this is what we've been trying to do, a campaign based on common sense. If somebody invades his neighbor, this is completely unacceptable. If somebody sends a missile against a residential building, it's completely unacceptable. We don't need to discuss this anymore. People understand this. So that's the basis of what we're trying to do.
I want to go to you, Héctor, just to introduce this conversation after going to Victoria, Alexandra, and Yaroslav. Why is necessary a campaign in Latin America? Why is important to invite the people to support Ukraine? It has been difficult in some cases, even with people who are writers, intellectuals, politicians. It's not easy to understand that a country has been invaded, a country has been attacked, people are being killed, but also you need to push it's difficult to bring these people to the campaign and to explain why it's necessary to support Ukraine.
Well, good afternoon. I am so happy of being here in Ukraine, in Kyiv today. I'm happy of being with you, colleagues and friends. And I am representing a big quantity of Latin American writers, historians, intellectuals, from Mexico to Argentina, but across Cuba, Colombia, Venezuela, Chile. Many of them are with Ukraine, are with you, and we are very proud of the people of Ukraine, of what you're doing for freedom and for the decolonization of the world and against an empire that tries to impose a way of living that is totally diverse from the way of living that I know, I suppose, and I know that you prefer. When you I am so happy that this fair is so plenty of people, is so full of readers. I think that when we have books, good literature, fiction, essays, history, we can really tell the truth to the world. And it's very important that so many readers are here today without fear, saying that books are important and that the truth is important. We in Latin America, maybe there are some countries or some governments who are undecided or who say words that are ambiguous about the invasion. But many governments are not ambiguous, and we, many writers from the region, are not ambiguous and are here with the Aguanta Ucrania, Hold On campaign, Hold On Ukraine, because you represent a big example for us, a great example for us of brave people without fear. So we are here without fear, with you and with our articles, with our words, to press also our governments to be with you, with the people of Ukraine. That is not always easy because of the history of our region. Some people in the left think that anything that comes from America, from North America, from the United States, is something that is imperial, because they were imperial in many ways in Latin America. But what they did years ago cannot justify what Putin and the Russians are doing now, trying to revive, to resurrect his old empire that doesn't exist anymore because of you. So we are really proud of being here. We arrived with the train of the night, plenty of mothers and children of Ukraine coming back probably to say hello to her husbands and fathers who are fighting in the war. And there is a commotion in our hearts seeing all of these. And there is also a commotion seeing the happiness of these many readers being here in the Arsenal for the books, in the books fair of the Arsenal. So maybe later I will explain more things about the campaign that Sergio Jaramillo began some months ago, and that we are trying to improve day after day. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being so nice with us. And please believe that we are here to support you and to learn from you and from the brave people of Ukraine. Thank you so much.
I think you are used to this because you are always in the street having your life, your resistance. For us foreigners, even for me that I was spending so much time in Ukraine, to see so many people together every day in the streets of Kiev. And today it's it really opens my heart, and it's a kind of really admiration for all Ukrainians. Oleksandra, thank you for being with us here, and I wanted to ask you a question. You were in Colombia in January. You have been traveling around the world. You have the opportunity to talk to so many people about Ukraine and how they see Ukraine from abroad. First of all, what was your impression? Because Latin America and Ukraine looks like they are very far away, but we have, and especially in some countries like Colombia, many cases in common, especially investigating war crimes as you do. Then tell me about a little bit of this experience. What do you find, and what is important these kind of campaigns?
Thank you very much. Maybe I will share my 3 main findings from the different advocacy trips which I myself and my human rights colleagues made for the past several months. When we speak especially about countries who are far from our context or very infiltrated with Russian propaganda, who for decades built very powerful informational networks in Latin America and Africa, in other parts of the world, we have to understand that something which is very visible for us, it's not visible for people in these countries. And I will always remember the non-formal conversation with me and my human rights colleagues from that countries, and they told it's not fair that Ukraine has so much attention when we lack this attention, when we had like our own human rights crisis, war crimes, etc., etc. And I answered that I feel your pain, because previous 8 years we have no attention. I know what I'm saying because I have been documenting war crimes for 9 years. And we was the first human rights organization who sent mobile groups in Crimea and Lugansk and Donetsk regions. And we primarily focus on the illegal practice of abduction, sexual violence, torture, and killing civilians on the Russian-occupied territories. And we sent numerous reports to UN, to Council of Europe, to OSCE, to European Union, and nothing changed. And I remember how I myself became frustrated, because I know when I interviewed the next people who survived Russian captivity, and they told me horrible stories, how they were beaten, how they were raped, how their fingers were cut, how they were tortured with electricity, and so on and so forth. In the same moment, the same horrible torture is going on in these occupied territories, and I can't stop it. So I told my colleague that I feel your pain, but situation is even worse. When large-scale invasion started, and we finally have this attention, all this attention for more than 1 year can't stop such Russian atrocities, and people here know, because this night we all spent in bomb shelter on corridors, and the remains of Russian rockets hit residential building in Kiev, and several people were died this night. So my first findings is that we have to be very calmly explain what's going on in Ukraine, because something which is very visible, which has become our everyday experience, it's not familiar, it's not understandable to people in countries who are far from the context. Second, my finding is that when we try to reach the audience, to the mind and to the heart of people, we have to rely upon something. And I found only 3 things which I can use just to build these bridges with audience which I don't know before. The first bridge is values. Because in this war, Ukrainians are fighting for freedom in all senses. We are fighting for freedom to be an independent country, not Russian colony. We are fighting for a freedom to preserve Ukrainian identity and not to be forced to educate our children as Russians. And we are fighting for it freedom to have our democratic choice, just a chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat peaceful student demonstration on Maidan Square. And countries and people who have the same value mindset are responsible to this. Second thing, it's experience. The problem is that this Russian war in Ukraine is not the one horrible things which are going on in the planet currently or in past decades. So when in Argentina I explain this horrible crime of illegal transfer in Ukrainian children to Russia and the forcible adoption of Ukrainian children, I see the understanding because people in Argentina subjected to the same behavior. And third, even when people don't share the values or don't have such experience, because first and foremost, we are all human beings, you can always rely upon empathy. And when I describe the story of a woman who lost her 2-day-old child after the Russian hit into maternity hospital, this pain of this woman, it's understandable to each people, regardless of their citizenship, their nationality, religion, ideology, political views, etc. So it's my second findings. What's the pillar we can use just to be able to share what's going on in Ukraine? And third, and I will finish with this year, which started for us from 24th of February last year, because yes, war going on for 9 years already, but to be in large-scale invasion, it's completely different experience. This year showed that our world is very interconnected. And there are a lot of things which have no limitation in national borders. Human pain is such things. And human solidarity is such things. And I'm very grateful for coordinator, organizers, and all people who are involved in this Uganda campaign in Latin America and support Ukrainians in this dramatic time of our history. Ukrainian people will always remember your support. Thank you.
Victoria, I also wanted to ask you, because you also go to the field to document war crimes, you are researching for your book, and you travel around the world also trying to explain and to talk about Ukraine. And you were also in Colombia when this campaign was launched, and you have met so many people during these 16 months, I'm sorry. Tell me about your experience. What is the most difficult for you to explain why to support Ukraine?
Thank you, Catalina, and thank you everyone for being here with us. I think the most difficult thing is this contrast, because being in a war zone, and you know this very well, Catalina, because you also travel always back and forth between war and peace. And this is difficult to explain, that although you notice every death and you try to memorize all the names and you try to learn on the stories, but war is basically when you cannot remember all the stories and you cannot memorize all the names. This is exactly what war is. I remember when in 2014, when there was a revolution of dignity and we had our first dead, just here in downtown Kyiv, and we all knew the names, and we no longer know the names. And Oleksandra was speaking about the common experience that can connect us, and I'm sure that Latin America and Ukraine can connect here, because I'm sure, and you're from Colombia, and you're from Colombia, so you can relate to this, because you also cannot remember all the names from your war. Sometimes in Wikipedia it's not called war but a conflict, but when I saw this I thought, no, why do they call it a conflict? This is a war and we should call it a war. So this is why it was very easy for me to be in Colombia and to talk to Colombians. In fact, it was a warm experience, and I have to tell to all Ukrainians here that when I've been to Colombia in January 2023 for 5 days, the only questions we've got, Oleksandra and I, and Andrei Kurkov, basically were, how can we help you? Because after we told the stories of the war crimes and how we're traveling around and seeing all the suffering and experiencing it, the only question we've got is, what should we tell our government? What support do you need? What can we do? And obviously, perhaps Colombia is not the main country who can send us F-16s and Leopard tanks, etc. But that was the question from the people of Colombia, and that was very warm and very important.
But I think Colombians understand very well. It's different kind of war, but they know very well what is to live in war with fear, starting the day in the morning without knowing what is going to happen at the end of the day. We, all of us, we have experienced that in different ways, and I think this really gives us a little understanding in certain ways of what you live as an Ukrainian every day. And Yaroslav, I wanted to ask you about writers and intellectuals are all around the world. It's not important about the language, it's about the job you do in society, documenting, reflecting the reality you are living. What has been the important role of the Ukrainian writers in this war, but also the importance for you, the support you are having, not just from Latin America, but also from other writers and intellectuals around the world? And what is this connection and how you are dealing with that?
Thank you, Catalina. I would like to first stress how we're grateful to you, because the empathy and sympathy between people, usually it depends on distance. The more distant you are, the less empathy people usually feel. And therefore, for us to have you here making a long journey through the ocean, every time I see those actions of solidarity, this is indeed something incredible, something miraculous. And I think that, of course, I mean, since 2014, a lot of Ukrainians were talking about, we're trying to break this geopolitical vision of the world. We're trying to break this idea that all the conflicts are just about big powers fighting between each other. So the Ukrainian history in the past decades is a history how you break the will and break the will of big powers. And I'm not only talking about Russia. I'm actually also talking about the West. Because if you take the 1990s, nobody in the West, I mean, with some exceptions, would be saying that Ukraine is part of Europe and part of the West. So it's not, it's with some exceptions with our friends, of course, but it's a willingness and it's a struggle of Ukrainians to prove that we no longer belong to the Russian world, right? So, and why, how we were proving that? Because we are saying, look, it's not about geopolitics. It's not about like you're living in America, in North America, and therefore you have democracy, and you are living in Ukraine and you don't have democracy. No, it doesn't work like that. It works like the question of how strong is society to challenge power. And sometimes in democratic, the so-called democratic countries, society is losing their force to challenge power. And in so-called non-democratic societies, non-something, we see that how society is actually getting stronger and stronger. So the optics that we have in Ukraine, now we're trying to look at other countries of the world in this way as well, and to break this very simplistic division between West and East, between Europe and non-Europe, etc. And you are helping us with this. Therefore, people from Latin America, people from Middle East, people from Africa, this is the talk that I'm always talking, okay, let's talk between ourselves. Let's talk horizontally. Let's not judge whose imperial power is is worse. Because, yeah, we realize that in Latin America, people look at United States as an imperial power. And it's normal. I mean, big powers are often imperial powers, right? So it's not like saying, okay, Russia is the worst imperial power than the United States. I think it's much more important to say in which way we are similar to each other, in which way our cultures can be in dialogue with each other directly. Maybe we have some similar attitude to time. Maybe we have some similar attitude to folk cultures in our societies. Maybe we have some similar attitudes to families. And therefore, I think it's really very important to break this geopolitics. So the values which Oleksandra has been talking, it's not a question of geopolitics. When we see at Iran and the protest at Iran, when we see at Arab Spring, when we look at Belarus in 2020, when we look at Ukraine during Euromaidan, when we look at Hong Kong, etc., this is all depasses these simplistic divisions between West and not West. And I think Ukrainian message to the rest of the world is that we can succeed in that. And freedom can really be strong in countries in which you would never think about, right? So Ukrainian message is a question of people who have been unheard for decades and even centuries. And it's a message to other nations that have been unheard. Look, we can do something so that the world hears us.
Thank you so much. And before we continue with this conversation, the campaign of Aguanta Ucrania prepared a video to show to you about how the campaign goes and what do we do, or what they do.
Very quick introduction. What you're going to see is just a small sample of dozens and dozens of writers, film directors, famous musicians that made the personal decision to go on the record, rejecting the invasion, expressing their solidarity with Ukraine, and putting themselves at your disposition, frankly. So we're going to see first Isabel Allende, who's probably the best-known Latin American writer, and then others in a short 4-minute summary.
Nosotros, los latinoamericanos, sabemos muy bien lo que es la agresión, la ocupación y la adversidad, porque por siglos lo hemos padecido. También sabemos lo que es el olvido. Sabemos lo que significa quitarle a un país
soberanía, territorio, cultura,
porque lo hemos vivido. Por eso no nos quedamos callados ante lo que está pasando en Ucrania.
Hola. Soy Sergio Jaramillo, el excomisionado de paz de Colombia desde Cartagena, Colombia. Esta es una campaña para levantar la voz de América Latina en solidaridad con el pueblo de Ucrania. Es una campaña a favor del sentido común, para llamar las cosas por su nombre. Invadir al vecino es lo que es, una invasión.
Putin invadió a Ucrania. Ucrania nunca agredió a Rusia. Esta es una invasión imperial en pleno siglo XXI que es inaceptable.
Hola, soy Carolina Amoroso, soy periodista argentina. Estoy por embarcarme en mi tercer viaje a Ucrania en un año. Viajé cuando se inició la invasión a gran escala por parte de la Federación Rusa en Ucrania. Aprendí todo lo que sé sobre el estoicismo y la resistencia, el verdadero significado del estoicismo. Al pueblo de Ucrania le debo haber encontrado nuevamente un sentido profundo a mi tarea.
Lo que ha ocurrido en Ucrania, la intervención militar, es algo que desde nuestra sensibilidad, desde nuestra historia, desde cualquier punto del derecho internacional, considero que es algo inadmisible. Por eso yo espero que Ucrania aguanta Ucrania.
Estoy aquí para decirles que la situación actual en Ucrania no tiene justificación. Rusia, no importa que sean sus argumentos culturales, ideológicos, geográficos, militares, no importa, no tiene justificación. Y la pérdida de vidas ucranianas ha sido altísima.
Ucrania no está en guerra, fue invadida. y en Latinoamérica estamos con las y los ucranianos.
Como nicaragüense sé lo que significaron para mi país las invasiones e intervenciones de Estados Unidos. Por eso no puedo estar de acuerdo con la invasión que sufre Ucrania.
Lo que está pasando en Ucrania es realmente grave y no se nos puede volver paisaje.
My country, Ukraine, was attacked and invaded by imperialist Russia. In this war, more than 20 of my colleagues, writers, poets, translators and publishers were killed by Russian missiles and bullets. This is not only imperialist war for territories, it is also war against Ukrainian culture.
Me uno a aquellos que quieren denunciar las violaciones que hemos visto por parte de Rusia en Ucrania. Mando un mensaje solidario que nosotros sentimos en el pasado como latinoamericanos.
Hola amigos, soy Paquito de Rivera y quiero mandar un saludo afectuoso y solidario con el heroico pueblo de Ucrania. Ucrania aguanta.
So I'm very grateful for all people who supported this campaign. There are a lot of things which have first appeared in the symbolical level, and we have not underestimate the power of human gesture and human solidarity. So thank you once again. Aguanta Ucrania.
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 Aguanta Ucrania. Aguanta Ucrania.
Aguanta Ucrania.
Aguanta Ucrania. Aguanta Ucrania.
Aguanta Ucrania.
Aguanta Ucrania.
Aguanta Ucrania.
Now you know better that you are not alone. You always know that you are not alone, but there are many, many people in Latin America who are with you every day thinking about the big fight that you are doing. Héctor, I want to go back to you, and because I think what Oleksandra was saying and all of us we were saying, there are many things that connect us as human beings. In our daily life, in our suffering, in our happiness, in our families, in everything. And I want you to tell me, how do you think we are connected? What can we do to connect it more, to understand more the suffering of Ukrainians and Ukrainians to understand more the suffering in Latin America?
Well, Catalina, the connection in the beginning was not so easy. Probably you will confound Uruguay and Paraguay or Bolivia and Colombia, and you think, okay, distant lands, distant countries, not very precise. Some years ago, for me, Ukraine was more or less the same. Was a country important for me, for some writers who were born here. I loved so much a Jewish writer for the Galician region, Joseph Roth, and I loved so much a Brazilian writer who was also, she was born here in Ukraine, Clarice Lispector, and then some Ukrainian writers also. But for me, Ukraine was a murky, a very nebulous country far away. Having a clear existence is not that easy. But now Ukraine has such a clear existence in the world. Before the war, before all these sufferings of the country, probably it was not in our distant countries so clear what was Ukraine, but now Ukraine is so clear in our minds, in our geography, and in our hearts. And so we are much more closer. Probably it's very sad that we need such an amount of sufferings, of resistance, such a big example of your proud of your braveness. But probably history is that way. Now that you want to be, and you are, and you will be independent, you are not a part of anything. You are not a peon. How do you say a peon? A pawn of the West or of the East, of any country. You are an independent country with your own culture, and we recognize you day after day more and more. And for me personally, it is also because of my publishing house here, that is a very small publishing house who publishes translations from Spanish, Compás books, from Anabel, from Marina, Marchuk, Anabel, from Anna, my translator. They, even before of the war, they began translating one of my books. And I was so happy and so surprised and so proud that my book was published in Ukrainian. And I wanted to come before of the war, but then it was the pandemia, the COVID disease, and I couldn't come. And then was the war. But now I am here, not especially for my book, but especially for you, for my publishers, and for the very brave people of Ukraine that demonstrated to the world that you are really incredible. If the Russian tanks could achieve that blitzkrieg, that war that they want to take Kyiv in 2 weeks, you demonstrate to the world that that was not possible because you are incredibly brave, and so we are here because you are such a great people with incredible representatives, also in the writers that are here with us. Thank you. Thank you so much for your words and for your books and for your publishing houses. Now we are really closer.
The power of human connection. I will never forget probably the most important radio in Colombia. At that moment, I was working with them. And just Russian attack Ukraine, and Kiev was under siege. Basically, all of you were living in basements without knowing what was going on. And one day they called, I don't know if it was Anastasia or Marina. Anabel. And they called Anabel. Anabel was living basically in a basement of the publisher house, and she started talking about the life in Kiev in that moment, their feelings, their fears. And Héctor, also from Medellin, I think you were in Medellin, he came also on air, and they started talking. All of us, if people didn't understand what was going on, they understood in that moment. All of us couldn't stop crying from listening Anabel and Héctor. I don't know if you knew each other personally or you just knew each other by email and by conversations, but it was probably the most beautiful and touching interview that made our listeners to understand what was going on. This is the power of connection and human beings, and I think this is the importance of this campaign, not just with Latin America, as you were saying, Volodymyr, with all around the world, with Africa. I live in Middle East. In Middle East also, they need to have this connection to understand they suffer, you also have it. And sometimes in Middle East, they will tell me, but yes, they don't talk about us as much as they talk about Ukrainian, but probably they don't understand what Oleksandra was saying. For many years, Ukrainians were also fighting, and nobody was talking about you. Then we need to talk more, to have more connections in order for understanding more. And Sergio, there is a factor that also connects Latin America and Ukraine, disinformation. We live this long peace process, very painful, very difficult, especially for you guys who were there doing this in behalf of all of us. But when you came out with this agreement, you confront this disinformation, that it was very painful. You have a referendum and the Colombian people vote no. How to say no to peace is what we did because the disinformation. Then I want you a little bit to reflect about how see things in common, what is going on.
Well, we know all about disinformation in Colombia, and as Oleksandra was pointing out, now in the case of the invasion, there's a massive disinformation machine in place of the Russians, beginning with RT television, which is quite watched in countries like Mexico. But the question I ask myself is, let's for a moment kind of stop complaining about disinformation, and let's think, how can we actually better connect? And this is something we've been discussing with Volodymyr and others in virtual meetings we've been doing, because I think this is very, very important. And to me, it is perfectly obvious that the first priority for Ukraine is to have guaranteed support from Europe and the US, because you need to win the war. This is obvious. But at the same time, you need to do something that's quite difficult, which is to open up more to the rest of the world and to think, what kind of things do we have in common? And from our side, we're trying to do the same. Because actually, when you scratch a little bit the surface, you will find, as many of our collaborators have said in the campaign, that we're not that far away at all, that we've had similar experiences. Oleksandra just talked about the case of the children in Argentina, and there are many, many cases like this. And nobody in Latin America feels, with the exception perhaps of the Brazilians, feels imperial and important. Everyone wants the protection of international law. Everyone wants the protection of human rights. Everyone understands suffering, and everyone feels mostly disadvantaged and really misunderstood by the world. And I think until the invasion, probably Ukrainians felt misunderstood because the war didn't start on the 24th of February, it started in 2014, and the world didn't understand. So how can we improve understanding? And I will actually, if you allow me, I will just throw this question at Volodymyr, because this is actually what we've been discussing. We want to build a direct connection between Latin America and Ukraine. We want to have our own stories to tell each other.
I was very happy to see some of the familiar faces in your video, and one of them is Carolina Amoroso, whom I already talked and made a very interesting interview for Ukraine World, and I asked her this question. So she came here on the day of invasion, and she was covering also Ukraine for Argentinian media, and I asked her in which elements of the Ukrainian society you recognize yourself? Like, which elements are familiar to you? Like, you're looking at Ukrainians and you see like a mirror, the same that you probably saw in Argentina. And she told me the role of women in society. So how, and she's writing a book about women. So we can talk about, Latin American women and Ukrainian women and how they are actually playing a very active role in society. This is one thing. Another familiar face is Gioconda Belli, Nicaraguan writer. And for our audience to understand, I don't know her story in detail, but as far as I understand, the Nicaraguan government expulses her from the country and even deposes her from the house, property. So it's a really very tragic situation. And it's amazing that even people who are facing this very difficult situation in their lives can express this support. And I actually started reading Gioconda Belli's novels. One of them is about Bible, it's about creation of the world, it's about Adam and Eve, and this is a very beautiful novel. But we Ukrainians, of course, can recognize ourselves in her story, because how many writers do we have who were just reduced to a person without anything, without dignity, without any human dignity? That's what we have in our generation of the 1920s, 1930s. And when you read those people who survived, like Ivan Bahryan and his the Garden of Gethsemane is one of the best novel about Soviet gulags. You see that how a person is feeling when he or she is brought to prison. One person cell in which 28 prisoners are kept. So this is also a story how we went through this, facing a power which completely erases the human dignity, reducing it just to biological material. And therefore, I think we have this connection. And interestingly, this just example of Gioconda Belli, who writes a novel about Christianity, about Bible, and trying to rethink it, and Ivan Bahrani, the Gethsemane's Garden, which also have reference. So we have similar codes, which can, for example, take place in Christian tradition or wherever else tradition, right? So it's I think very interesting. And another thing I would really think is how we make a communication between tradition and modernity. Because what I feel is that in many Latin American societies and cultures, we have these attempts to find a balance between the past and the future, between tradition and modernity, that we have in Ukraine, very, very present in our culture.
We don't have the long history that you have, that sometimes is very difficult to understand and to explain all the changes in borders and empires and so on, that makes also very complicated to explain to Latin America. And we are a very young continent. We are not using our culture to think about that, and sometimes make it complicated to people to understand. And that's why also it's very easy for the disinformation to play in this role. But Oleksandra, I wanted to ask you the issue of democracy. That for us here is like all of us, we know we are fighting, everyone in their aspect. But sometimes I feel that not everyone has it clear in the world around, in Latin America and in another continents, not in the far left and not in the right. There are many people who don't see that as a value, and probably they like to have very strong powers. We see that in Bukele in Latin America. There are some people who support kind of Bukele power, and we see this kind of powers all around the world. Then how do you see that? How really to fight and to explain the importance of fighting for these values, democracy and liberties?
It's a real serious problem, because for a huge part of the world, this war started in February 2022. But we know that for Ukrainians, this war started in February 2014, when Ukraine obtained a chance for the quick democratic transformation after the collapse of the authoritarian regime due to Revolution of Dignity. It was the time when millions of Ukrainians stood up their voice against authoritarian and corrupt Yanukovych government, and we paid a rather high price for this. I know what I'm saying about, because for that moment I was a coordinator of Euromaidan SOS initiative. We united several thousands of volunteers throughout the country, and every day hundreds and hundreds of people who were beaten, who were arrested, who were tortured, who were accused and fabricated criminal or administrative charge passed through our care, and finally more than 100 peaceful protesters were gunned down by police in the center of Kiev. So when authoritarian regime collapsed and we obtained a chance for democratic transformations, Putin started this war of aggression, occupied Crimea, part of Lugansk and Donetsk regions, and last year Russia expanded this war for the large-scale invasion. And this is very important to remind, because this clearly shows that Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom which came closer to Russian border. And this means that it's not just a war between two states, Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And with this war, Putin tried to punish Ukrainians for our democratic choice, which we made 9 years ago. And also, he tried to convince the whole world that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are fake values because they couldn't protect you during the war. So it's not just a task for Ukraine to respond something to this claim, it's a common responsibility of the entire international community. And in this regard, I would like to make a link what peace means for Ukrainians. Because I work directly with people affected by this war. And I know that Ukrainians need peace much more than anyone else. But peace will not come if country which was invaded stop fighting. It will be not a peace, it will be occupation. And occupation is horrible. It's just another forms of the war. Occupation means torture, rape, filtration camps, forcible deportation, forcible mobilization, abductions, and murders. In this war, we have no other chance. If we stop fighting, there will be no more us.
Victoria, your book just been translated to Spanish and is being published, and we just realized that there are not so many Ukrainian writers translated to Spanish. What is the importance of our language to be interconnected, translated from Spanish to Ukrainian, Ukrainian to Spanish, and which has been the feedback you have received until now?
Thank you very much, Catalina, for this question, because I was going to say that Latin America is so popular here in Ukraine, and that in fact, even before we all met, and obviously our enemies didn't expect us to meet. Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation is precisely designed for us to not meet. This is why their propaganda is so despicable. They just demonize Ukrainians and they expect you to never meet me. And so you could believe we are all Nazis here. But we all met you through your translations, and you were talking about Clarice Lispector, which is like my goddess and one of my favorite writers, and she's really widely translated in Ukrainian. And I mean, not to mention Marquez and Borges, so I mean, the entire world reads them. And in my favorite Shevchenko Park, which was also hit by a Russian missile on October 10th, 2022. For me, it was a park where people dance Argentinian tango and salsa. And so for Ukrainians, of course, Latin American culture is a thing. But yes, we perhaps need to close the gap in translating Ukrainian literature. And of course, I'm very happy and humbled that my novel, Dim dla Doma, in Ukrainian, Dom Dream Kingdom in English, is now translated into Spanish and came out in Spain. And the feedback is great because basically right now Spanish readers are reading this novel as a kind of brief history of Ukraine. They had to of course, make some footnotes to understand what the Great Famine is, what 1937, the Great Terror, means to us, what the revolutions were. So they had to make many footnotes, but as my publisher says, when a reader completes reading your novel, they will know the entire history of Ukraine. But of course, yeah, we would love our classics, Ukrainian classics, to be translated, and of course we would love to, to our cultures to be interconnected, because it is very good, it's great that you see us now, but we really would love the entire world to see Ukraine's culture, not only Ukraine's bravery.
Probably we should do a list of Ukrainian books that Latin Americans should read and post it in our social media of the Aguanta Ucrania. I think it will be very nice for Latin Americans to have a guide of writers to follow from Ukrainian.
Yeah, we have a list of 100 novels in Ukrainian made by Pen Ukraine, so we could just send it to you.
We need to take the ones who have been translated at least to Spanish, French, and English. Probably we'll get it. I don't know, just the time, it's getting to the end, but does anyone has a question, just a question to any of the panelists here?
Actually, it will not be a question. I will just say thank you in the native language. Quería decirle muchas gracias por todo que estás haciendo. Es increíble. Yo tengo amigos de Colombia, de Medellín. Una de mis amigas es de Medellín, sí. También sí, de México, de Argentina, de Cuba, que vivían y viven aquí en Kiev. Y cuando vuelven a casa a visitar sus padres, sus familias, pero siempre están diciendo que vamos a volver a Ucrania, que Ucrania es nuestra casa, y es lo que toca mi corazón. Y muchas gracias por todo lo que estáis haciendo, lo apreciamos.
¿Cuál es tu nombre?
Verónica.
We have seen a lot of people who speak Spanish here in the public, but it's absolutely amazing, and speaking a very beautiful, muy bonito español. Muchísimas gracias. Any other question, or shall we make the conclusions of the conversation? There. I'm sorry. You were first.
Okay. First of all, thank you. And I have a question. And what's the voice of the scientists, of translators in the Latin America? And do the government listen to you and to your voice, or there are some problems maybe with delivering your position to the government and to the political bodies?
Who want to?
I will take advantage of this question to invite you all to look at our Instagram account, which is the same phrase, hashtag Aguanta Ucrania. And there you will find all the writers, friends of Héctor, some friends of mine, some friends of friends. You will find film directors, you will find singers, you will find human rights defenders, and probably we need to get now the scientists. But what I want to leave with you is the idea that even though governments think they have to act geopolitically and be quite timid and not say very much, that's not true of most people. When you actually talk to most people, they understand. And this is why we need to connect, and we need to open channels and create scenarios and have a conversation.
I think we own you a question because you were first.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for your discussion. I just have a brief question regarding, as far as I know, in your schools, mostly you focus on Spanish literature and Latin American literature. Do you think there is anything we can do about cooperation in terms of school education to include Ukraine in the scope of Latin American kids and teenagers?
Well, at the moment, I have no idea, but I would think maybe we can talk and we can imagine something. My brain is so slow. I think very slowly, and I don't have an answer at the moment, but I think it's a brilliant idea, and we can discuss that and maybe bring there some ideas for doing something similar. What you say. Thank you very much.
I will just add one word, which is, I don't know where she is. This very, very nice young lady who's running around somewhere, Marina, who along with her colleague Annabelle are the editors and translators of Vektorova into Ukrainian. And it's actually thanks to Marina that we're really here. So first point, apart from education in schools, we need more translations. We need books to circulate. But I did actually want to ask for a small applause for Marina for the work he's doing, bringing us here, but for translating this man into Ukrainian.
I just wanted to add that, in fact, you see, we are speaking English here, and when we were in Colombia, we were perhaps the only guests who didn't speak Spanish, because American and British authors who came to Cartagena spoke Spanish. So, of course, I'd like to emphasize that it is very important for the kids in Ukrainian schools to start learning Spanish as a second language or the third language, and that would be also an important initiative to take. And Ukrainian Pen is already collecting books in English to be brought to Ukrainian libraries, especially in the liberated villages and towns, and we could start the similar initiative in Spanish.
We should do it. We should do it. Thank you, Victoria, thank you, Oleksandra, thank you, Jaroslav, for being with us, and of course to Héctor and Sergio that they came to see the reality of Kiev, this beautiful life, even with all the problems and attacks, and willing from the other side to destroy this country that they never happened and they never managed to do it. Then I'm very pleased to spend time with you Ukrainians here in this country. Every day that I spend here, I feel grateful because I have managed to tell your story, and thank you for Sergio for this idea of Aguanta Ucrania.
No, finally, really, I'll just repeat what I said at the beginning with Héctor. We're here most of all in the name of all our friends to thank you, because what you're doing is preserving the freedom of all of us.
Дякую, Ukraine.
Muchas gracias.